Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm your host, Aga Bayer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It gives you the tools and inspiration to make work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. This is where we explore how to cultivate remarkable cultures that scale and evolve as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
Culture and connection don't just happen in an office, right? People who are given flexibility feel a higher sense of connection, and they actually are more likely to say their culture is improved, in part because they're given the flexibility, but also in part because giving them that, saying, I'm going to base my opinion of you on your outcomes, not on your appearance, is a way of saying that I trust you. And that trust goes a long way towards building, more positive cultures and honestly better outcomes.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 130 of the Culture Lab podcast, and Happy New Year if you are listening close to the release date. This episode is brought to you by Culture Brain, a one-of-a-kind accelerator program where culture leaders get hands-on support and guidance on how to reach their goals faster, especially now in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. Culture Brain connects you with outstanding peers on the same journey, but also with world-class experts, including people you know from the show. And they all help you identify and implement new, better ways of creating a culture where people do their best work. Check it out at tinyurl.com/culturebrain. And no need to write it down. There's a link in the show notes. So here's an interesting question. What does it actually take to build teams that are highly effective in this brave new world of work? And what's the relationship between making work better for people and the outcomes that organizations can achieve? That is just a piece of the conversation that we dive into today's rich exploration with Brian Elliott. Brian spent 25 years building high-growth companies and leading teams as a startup CEO, leader at Google, and executive at Slack and Salesforce. He most recently co-founded Future Forum, a consortium that enables leaders to redesign work through data and dialogue. Brian is also the author of a bestseller, How the Future Works, Leading Flexible Teams to Do the Best Work of Their Lives. But we go in many different places with Brian in this conversation. We dive into his background, into the value of change in our careers, in how to maintain a legacy business while you are building a new thing, and much, much more. So, with no further ado, here is my wonderful guest today, Brian Elliott.
I'm Brian Elliott. I'm a leadership advisor that helps leaders build a future of work that's better for people and for their organizations.
Welcome, Brian.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited about this conversation. I've been looking forward to it for a long time because one of the things that we want to explore on this show is where are we going when it comes to work? And you are one of the people that I look to your insights to figure out what's happening right now. You've been doing amazing work, so I can't wait to dive into that. But before we go there, every conversation that I have with every guest starts in the same way. And the question that I always ask at the beginning is, what were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person? How did you grow up?
So I grew up as a child of a single mom in the Midwest of the US in a very small town. I was the only child of a single mom that I was aware of in my town. Me and my younger brother were raised by her. And I was also a geek. I was a math geek and maybe a little bit of an outsider growing up. Felt very lonely as a kid often. But it also meant that I buried my head in books and became a learner and just sort of stuck into that. And that really shaped a lot of my attitude around life and understanding what outsiders can feel like at times. But it also sort of drove a lifelong passion around learning too, which has been really fantastic for me.
Was that why you ended up working for BCG for a while?
Yeah. I went off to college and was a math major, stats geek, economics, and all the rest of it. I actually had a side love, which was musical theater, where I was a stage manager. Really loved the job. But Boston Consulting Group was a place where I could apply those sort of math geek skills pretty well. And in fact, it kind of went at that point from being the outsider and being, the kid that felt like he didn't belong to being somebody who really did, right? And if anything, it actually created a different set of problems because I was really good at it. And, my ability to run numbers and do analysis kind of became a cudgel. And I got a little arrogant, more than a little arrogant, which is something I learned after I jumped out into startups and left BCG. But I left BCG because I wanted to learn. I felt like I had stagnated. I'd stopped learning.
For a lot of us, I can identify with your story because I always felt like an outsider as well, where I was growing up back behind the Iron Curtain in communist Poland. And I never felt like I belonged there. So I totally identify with that. I think there's this amazing feeling when you find your tribe and suddenly you're like, oh, these are my people. And suddenly I fit in. And as you say, it can become constraining at some point because you are definitely playing to your strengths. And I totally get that sense that, ooh, I'm no longer evolving. And also perhaps I'm getting a little bit full of myself. So things need to change and need to shift. And so, as you said, you moved into a different world. You worked for Google, you worked for Slack in entirely different, well, maybe not entirely different, but in a different capacity, in a different role. And I can only imagine that was a major transition for you. What was it like for you?
It really was. It was huge. Even before I went to Google, I went into startups, like very early stage companies. And when I first came there from BCG, you're absolutely right. You sort of get to a tribe that you know really well, right? And at BCG, I knew that tribe very well, and I knew how everybody operated. Matter of fact, I ran recruiting for the Chicago office for a while, meaning I knew the shape and form and attitudes of people that would be successful. But jumping into startups, I got knocked on my butt a bunch because I really didn't know how to lead people who had different backgrounds, who had different aspirations, who had different skill sets. And a very wise woman, Mariah De Leon, who's a lifelong friend of mine, was my people partner at the time. And she took me aside one day and said, Brian, you're a jerk. And
Wow.
she was right. She was right. It was that sort of arrogance wasn't helping me out, right, in terms of building relationships with people who had different skills and different backgrounds and different orientation. And I learned. I listened to her and was really grateful that she said that. But over the next decade in startups, what I learned was building trust, building a sense of belonging among people who have different backgrounds, who come from different places, who have different challenges, who have different needs in their lives, really is the key to unlocking success in a business. It's the old trite phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? But I'd been a strategy consultant. I had been trained that strategy was the most important thing. And I kind of had to get knocked down to figure out that that was not correct. It was actually your ability to build inclusive teams that actually was going to drive whether or not you were able to hit your business goals. And I relearned that several more times in my career as well.
Yeah, it's funny sometimes with these learnings that we really get the lesson over and over again until we master it. I find this in my career and in my life as well, that certain things that I struggled with, I had to try and learn them a few times. And I think it's an ongoing journey around certain issues. But wait, I can't glaze over that conversation that you had.
Yeah.
Tell me more about how is it possible that someone tells you, hey, Brian, you are a jerk. And instead of getting defensive and saying, okay, F off,
Yeah.
you actually open up and listen and embrace that feedback. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. I will admit, I'm not sure that I first embraced it, right? There was a head of engineering, and the head of engineering and I were at loggerheads all the time. The two of us could not see eye to eye. And I was also running a sales team, and salespeople had a very different orientation than I did. And my team was also more diverse. And I just kept stumbling through these things and stumbling through me being convinced that I was right and why weren't people listening to me. Mariah gently once or twice prodded me. But I think the you're a jerk was really the sort of her way of calling it out a little more strongly for me. It's shocking, right? And it kind of gets to you. And at that point, I was listening a lot more because I was realizing I wasn't getting where I wanted to go, right? The style that I was using really wasn't helping me either. And so, yeah, it was a little bit of a shock to the system. And yeah, I'm sure I was defensive at first, but I also thought about it enough to realize that what I was doing wasn't going to get me where I wanted to go, and certainly wasn't going to get the team where they needed to go. And so I took it as an opportunity to sort of start chatting a little bit more with other people, like my head of sales, Shelly, and saying, "Hey, what do you need? What's going to make you successful?" With Steve, the head of engineering, about like, how do we work this out? What's our relationship? And those conversations I realized became more important than the conversations I'd been having before about the strategy or who needed to do what in the project we were working on.
And this is really interesting to me because a lot of people that we work with, and we've also built a community for people who focus on culture a lot, either because they are in a people and culture position or a CEO who considers that to be incredibly important to their company's success, like you eventually came to realize. And a lot of conversations that we have with these folks, a lot of them are in the scaling, on the scaling journey of their business, is how do you strike that balance between focusing on people and creating that enabling environment and having the conversations that you've just mentioned and results? There seems to be a tension. Maybe it's a false tension, but there seems to be a tension. And sometimes people tell me all these wonderful things that we do for people don't translate into great results. So, like, you can have a great culture where people genuinely have fun working together, but it doesn't translate into results. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do think that they both can go together, but I do think you have to design it that way. So part of this is you also have to have aspiration and goals and outcomes that you want to hit, and you need to be, somewhat aggressive in what those look like. But you need to build a team where people feel like they're in it together and that they can trust one another, that they've got each other's backs. I'll give you another example. It's sort of like in retrospect, I realized, 25 years later, that one of the things I was actually really good at was cultural turnarounds in businesses that were a business turnaround. So I went to Google and inherited a business called Google Express, which was a same day, next day delivery service, shopping oriented tools with a whole bunch of retailers involved. And when I took that on as general manager of it, it was a business that had struggled. And it had struggled in terms of traction with customers, it had struggled in terms of its economics, a whole bunch of other issues. But it also was really struggling internally because people weren't listening to each other. The heads of operations and engineering weren't talking to each other, or if they were in very raised voices, shouting in hallways type of conversations. There were other people that were feeling like they were left out of the conversation, especially women, especially younger workers in the organization, and who felt like they didn't have a voice. And all of that led to a lot of time and energy spent on disagreements internally about what we were going to do next to improve the business. So all that time and energy that was the internal lack of alignment really was holding us back. And so what we had to do was both things at the same time. We had to figure out what's the North Star, what are the set of goals, what are the most important things for us to accomplish. And we had to learn new ways of listening to one another, even figuring out and better defining roles and responsibilities of who was accountable to whom and for what. And the last one that sat underneath all of this was none of that was going to work if people felt like the loudest voices, the most male voices, the most senior voices in the room were the only ones that were being heard. And so I spent a lot of time listening and getting groups of those folks together who felt like they were not being listened to in order to make this feel like a place where they could actually share what they knew, which actually was critically important to achieving the goals. So you got to do both at the same time. You have to set high aspirations for a team. You have to clarify roles and responsibilities, but you also have to make the environment safe for people to say, we're not going to get there unless you actually take into account this bit of information that I happen to have over here.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And it's an ongoing journey, right? You really need to keep your focus on both of these all the time. And sometimes I feel like people have a sense, oh, right, so we fixed the team dynamics. We can now focus on getting better results. But we all know that this really is not, it's like mowing your lawn. You can't do it once and consider it done. It requires some consistency. Next question, I guess, is It's a fascinating world, of course, the world of startups and scale ups and tech. And my question is, how do you then decide to leave that world? And what was the thing that compelled you to pursue next?
From startup world to Google actually even was a sort of a sidestep. It was really interesting. I'd been doing startups for 12 years. I'd been CEO of a company that had 300 employees in it. And I went to Google because I'd sort of stalled out. All I knew was how to run and operate small companies. I hadn't operated in a big company. And I jumped into Google in a job that had 2 employees reporting to me when I first started, doing a job I could have done 10 decades earlier. But it was an opportunity to be in an organization where I was going to learn something different. I then ended up inheriting this much larger business that I described already. But that was a growth career trajectory change even within that. I did the same thing again when I went to Slack and took on the developer platform there. But that was a similar job, but a similar like step into a smaller company, but with a lot of growth potential. After a couple of years of doing that, though, I started getting itchy because I knew, how to operate and run that team of people. But even the work that we were doing wasn't something that I felt deep passion about. Developer platforms are fantastic, but my own level of passion is just not there for right formulation of a API and automated programming interface. I wanted to do something different. The pandemic had also just started when I basically went to Stuart Butterfield, Slack's CEO and co-founder, along with a couple other folks, and said, "Hey, Stuart, you've talked in the past about Slack should back a think tank around the future of work. I think this is the time to do it because people are much more open to new ways of working than they ever have been in the past. And we're going to learn so much through this sort of forced change that everyone is going through in terms of how we work." And so I founded Future Forum along with 2 fantastic co-founders, Sheila Subramanian and Helen Cupp, because it was sort of a learning opportunity for us personally, a way in which we could try to make a world of work that we think is more what we would like it to look like, and a way that we thought might actually influence, outcomes for a lot of organizations. And so that's why I jumped into that one as my sort of next step and next career.
What I love about this story is the fact that you are in this organization that actually is willing to support you to kind of pursue your passion in a certain capacity. And I found that a lot of organizations that are incredibly successful, they have mastered this ability to let people pursue what lights them up. I think it's such a fantastic example of, how you eventually work your way out of an organization, but still maintain these ties because they're still supporting you in your development. We have a lot to learn from Slack, and it just, confirms my belief that Slack is doing a lot of things well. And I'm glad that you were able to pivot because we are learning a lot from you. And that moment during the pandemic was a pivotal moment for us, for my company as well. That was the moment where I had exactly the same realization, which was we've been supporting organizations to cultivate a great workplace culture. And now suddenly no one knows how to move forward from here. And everyone feels this sense of, wow, maybe it's an opportunity to really redefine work or the way we work and start doing new things that are more effective. I wonder, as you reached that realization and founded the Future Forum, which direction did you take and what did you learn through your research?
Future Forum itself was founded not on a set of beliefs that the research we were doing was going to be about how technology is wonderful and it's going to change, the world, or that, offices were good or bad, but much more about what's it take to actually build teams that are highly effective, and what's it take and what's the relationship between making work better for people and the outcomes that organizations can achieve coming out of this. And so we did a lot of research into what was working and what wasn't for different groups of people in different countries and different locations based on the processes, policies, and setups that their companies provided to them. And so there were 3 kind of key things that we learned coming out of this. One was just the importance of flexibility. And that's a debate that still rages today about remote work versus in the office and how it works.
Will it ever be over, Brian? What do you think?
I wish we're 3 years into what I think is honestly the stupidest argument in many ways, because honestly, how many days a week someone is in the office is one of the least important factors in driving productive teams and outcomes. One of the things we found, in fact, was that time matters more than place. Giving people a couple hours per day of uninterrupted focus time, no notifications going off, no calls, no meetings, no nothing, is a much bigger boost to their productivity than, being in the office, not being in the office. That was one of the things that we learned coming through this, was that flexibility actually benefits every aspect of work. You do have to find ways in which teams come together to build camaraderie, to build teamwork, to build culture, which we can get into.
Sure.
That was one. The other is this sense of flexibility is actually disproportionately helpful to people who historically have not been well represented at work, right? Like, I'm a 55-year-old white male who was not the primary caregiver for my kids when they were little. I had it easy. Unfortunately, a lot of people like me are the ones that are setting a lot of the policies and rules and saying, hey, look, we just need to get back to what works for me. What they're not realizing is that, in particular, when we looked at the data, working moms more than working dads wanted workplace flexibility. People who are Black, Hispanic, Latinx, Asian American in the US, where we could get the data deep enough to actually look at racial and ethnic differences, value flexibility in the workplace because it gives them a break from continual code switching in how they walk and how they talk and how they show up. And you can see it in other aspects too, one of which is even neurodiversity, right? One of my co-authors, Helen Cupp, is very much the introvert and very much does not want to be the person who's put on the spot to do instant brainstorming in a meeting. But Helen is one of the brightest, most brilliant human beings that I know on the planet. Give her a way in which she can think about the idea beforehand, come up with ideas, and then share them, and you're going to get spectacular results. So you can create a new way of including people if we just rethink some of how we work and how we come together. And the last thing that we learned through the course of this is culture and connection don't just happen in an office, right? People who are given flexibility feel a higher sense of connection, and they actually are more likely to say their culture's improved, in part because they're given the flexibility, but also in part because giving them that, saying, I'm going to base my opinion of you on your outcomes, not on your appearance, is a way of saying that I trust you. And that trust goes a long way towards building, more positive cultures and honestly better outcomes.
Yeah. You had this fantastic piece that I've read recently about the relationship of trust and productivity. And I really loved it. I think it's a very powerful formula to talk about what really leads to productivity. Because back to your points that you've made about a certain group of people wanting people back in the office, we know from various surveys that there is a huge disconnect between what top tier or senior leaders want to happen and what the majority of people want to happen, and also perceptions around, are people being productive when they are not in the office? Senior leaders believe people are not productive. The rest of the employees are actually convinced that they are way more productive when they are given this flexibility. So could you talk a little bit about the formula for high productivity, which, as you say in your article, is really this combination of trust and, as you say, relentless focus on the outcomes?
Yeah, exactly right. So from a productivity standpoint, there's all kinds of academic studies, but basically if you go through every single one of them and comb them, what you'll find is that if you give people more flexibility, they're going to be more productive. And in fact, they'll actually choose the setup that works best for them, including people who are more productive in the office will want the office and they will come to the office. A lot of executives, unfortunately, are nervous and apprehensive, and they're going off of anecdotes and off of fear often, right? Which is, I'm not sure that they're really working. How will I know they're really working? Therefore, I need them back in the office. If you're an executive and you're concerned about that, and you're concerned about quiet quitting, one of my least favorite terms, and your decision then is, great, then I need people back in the office 4 days a week. And you tell everybody, I need you back in the office 4 days a week to be with your teams and to be productive. What you're really saying is, I don't trust you. And that is an instant turnoff. What we've seen, and there's all kinds of data out there, but Slack actually, the research team put out a piece this summer that was really great that actually looked at this and said, if people don't feel trusted by their managers, they are far less likely to go the extra mile. They're far more likely to simply check the box, to do the bare minimum of work that's required. Therefore, if you're an executive concerned about quiet quitting and you force people back in the office, what you're creating is quiet quitting. So you just got the outcome that you didn't want to have by doing the thing that you did. That's one side of it. The other side, though, is if you look at organizations that have higher outcomes. So, Institute for Corporate Productivity did this study where they took companies and said, let's take everybody in an industry and let's stack rank them on the basis of who's got the highest growth, the most profitability, the highest customer satisfaction, and we'll compare them to the people at the bottom of the stack. The biggest difference between the top and the bottom is, do I feel trusted by my senior leadership? And does senior leadership trust the people in the organization? So trust builds productivity and outcomes. But every executive I talk with will also say, but how do I just have trust? And the answer is, you don't. I understand that. You've got to have two other ingredients. You have to have this aspiration around outcomes, right? You need to know what outcomes you're trying to drive. And people need to have accountability to those outcomes. So you have to build systems that allow you to do two things at once, right? I trust you to deliver an outcome, but I'm also going to work with you to make sure that I know from a team perspective and an individual perspective what those outcomes are that we're trying to drive. If you can do that, you can build an environment where you let people have the flexibility they want to be productive, but you can also, by the way, achieve higher outcomes and better results at the same time.
What I hear you saying this is that, especially now, we really need to be more focused on making sure that we create that clarity for people when it comes to what the desired outcomes are. Because, I mean, people have always had this need, obviously, to know, what do you expect from me? And I think, frankly, in my personal experience, this has always been something that's been lacking in organizations. Usually it's quite hazy. There are some KPIs, but generally we talk about priorities in plural, right?
Yeah,
Which, of
exactly.
course, it doesn't make a lot of sense, even linguistically speaking. I mean, from the language point of view, there is one priority. And so how do we create that clarity that gives people that direction so that they know what is expected from them without over engineering it? What is the Goldilocks zone here?
Yeah, I do think it's hard, and it's not there's no simple one formula that's going to get you there. But I do think it goes back to, what are the top objectives for the organization from a longer term perspective, right? What matters most to you in terms of, is it customer growth? Is it profitability? Is it, you want to be the best at X, you want to be the top rated company in Y? What are those top level objectives that you've got? And what are the key results, objectives and key results? They're going to get you there over the course of the next year. And how do you measure what those look like? The trap that you're describing is, too many organizations have all of the objectives and every key result, and it basically encompasses the entirety of the organization without any stack ranking, right? So one of the things that I actually found most effective that I carried from my startup days was literally being able to stack rank those things and say, this is the most important thing, right? This project, this objective, this set of results for our team is the most important thing for us. Here's number two, here's number three. Because you do get to a point where your team is big enough, your organization is big enough that one thing alone may not be the answer. But it's really important for people to be able to say, hey, look, I'd love to work with you on number six, but unfortunately, I'm needed on number two. I need to get that done. We need to get that done first, because as an organization, we have agreed, our leadership is aligned around that. And that's usually where it falls apart, is where I've seen the challenge. It's really about leadership being able to say, look, we've gotten around the table and we've actually drawn a line and said, I know that Bob would like to do that project, but that project's not going to happen because we don't have the resources for it. The art of this is not just that stack rank, it's also, here's the things we are not doing.
Yeah, that's strategy, right?
Exactly.
Brian, I want to channel our audience here because I know for a lot of people who are listening, they are in a business that has a legacy product or legacy business that is still giving them significant revenue. And there's a movement towards building a new business, a new product, and that's the priority. But at the same time, you need to maintain the old in order to make this transition. And I find a lot of organizations stuck somewhere in the middle there. And it's a very difficult place to be. Personally, in my business, I'm experiencing something like this as well. And so I want to pick your brain on this because I know that you've been through these moments with the organizations that you worked with. What are your words of wisdom for us?
It is so hard, Aga. That is such a great question. I've been exactly there. And it's challenging because people know that they are in the business that's being quote unquote left behind, right? Or that is less important. And I think part of what you need to do is help people within those organizations figure out what's in it for them. What are they looking for personally? What are the growth opportunities that they're seeking? And how are we going to bring that to bear? So I'll give you an example. When I was in startup mode, one of the things that we did is we had a legacy business, right? In the legacy business, we were running for cash because the cash we were running for that was going to build a new software business on top. And so, of course, everybody wanted to work on the new software business that was, the shiny penny, the next new thing. But we needed people on that kind of base business as well. So we did a few things. One is we actually rotated people. So we would rotate engineers across those two business units over periods of time that were long enough that they could be productive and effective in one and then move back into the other and then back and forth. And the other is there was some element of self selection too, because being in the shiny penny new growth business it was higher demand, right? It was going to be harder work. It was more challenging. It was more uncertain. You weren't sure what next week was going to look like, let alone tomorrow some days. And so there's also a fit element to this too, in terms of what's your tolerance for ambiguity? What's your level of uncertainty around this? And sometimes those big shiny objects don't work out, at which point there's also more risk about what's going to happen to you and to your job. So there are trade-offs that aren't always easy that I think involve us being open with people about what are your aspirations, what are you looking to do, how are you looking to grow, and what the business needs.
I love that. This is super useful. So, we talked a lot about the benefits of flexibility and the importance of trusting people and being super clear about what the desired outcomes are. But of course, there are some downsides or challenges, let's say, when it comes to hybrid and remote work. So, let's get honest here. What do you see in terms of those negative aspects? And are there any ways that we can address them effectively?
I'll give you two. One is fairly straight, maybe a little more straightforward. One is that you still have to get people together. We use this phrase at Slack and at Future Forum. Digital first doesn't mean never in person. There actually really is a critical element to bringing people together in person to build belonging with one another. My team would get together once a quarter for 3 or 4 days, and we would spend more than half of that time on social aspects of work. We would do meals together. We would do volunteer activities together. We would do paired walks in the woods, spending that time not on just the planning of the business, but on getting to know one another as human beings was really essential in terms of just kicking up that flywheel of feeling a sense of belonging and understanding one another, especially in a diverse team. There's evidence behind this too. Atlassian, a big software company, did a study that found those quarterly gatherings generate goodwill and engagement that lasts for 4 or 5 months, right? When you do it, you also have to make sure that you don't end up with a birds of a feather problem. There's a professor, Raj Chowdhury at Harvard Business School, who did a study that showed when you pull these groups together, one of the risks is all the white guys get together and cluster. The solo female engineer does not and gets left out, like happens in offices. So making sure that you're mixing it up is important. And that leads me to the other big concern that I've got when it comes to hybrid and flexible work, which is this phrase proximity bias. We still have a number of leaders who are very used to a world in which the signals, the visual signals of someone showing up, especially of hustle culture, are indicators of success. So Johnny shows up early, Johnny stays late, therefore Johnny is going to get the next big opportunity is really problematic, especially when you consider that the people coming in to the office most often are white, male, older, non-primary caregivers. So we have to actually be aware of it, number one. So the first thing that I've found with executives is making sure that they understand it. And it's always surprising to me how few are aware of the differences across race, gender, ethnicity. But the second is we need to go back to that point about managing on the basis of outcomes, right? If you put the hard work into aligning your executive team on what outcomes you're trying to drive, if you ladder that down your organization in terms of goals and how that goes down to functions and sub teams, and if you then hold people accountable to the outcomes they generate, you can create a level playing field that hopefully reduces the risk of proximity bias in organizations.
I'm curious about the phrase that you used, and this actually got me thinking about my own research. I've done some primary research about the conditions that people need in order to do their best work. And unsurprisingly, one of these conditions is a sense of belonging. And what I discovered was that there was a continuum of belonging that starts with very fundamental, essential, and straightforward things like seeing people. And what I mean by that, acknowledging people. But you use the word flywheel, and it's really, it clicked for me because I think the continuum is actually sort of a flywheel because, of course, all these things reinforce the next thing. So I'm curious, when you think about belonging, especially in this new world of work, what are the elements in your flywheel or stages of that? So, how do you reinforce that? Because you say this is how you kick it off, but then what is the next stage that you want to see? And is there a progression in your mind?
I think there is, because part of it is, and I'm not sure that I've got the exact formula for it. I mean, I really do like being seen as one element of it, but I think that it has to be built step by step by step. It doesn't just happen instantaneously because you bring everybody together for an offsite, right? Usually it starts well before that, which is, how do you even operate as a team in the first place? I'll give you a couple examples. There's a couple of tools that I like to use in doing this, one of which is personal user manuals. Think of it as a way to go deeper, faster on your needs versus my needs, your proclivities versus my proclivities. I'm a morning person, right? And so knowing that I'm a morning person, that I don't do well in meetings that happen after 4 o'clock in the afternoon because my brain turns to mush, that's probably a good thing for you to know about me. In the same way that, like, I'm much better at reading a document than I am watching a video to get information, right? So the basics of that give us a little bit of insight into the teams that we're working with. Once you've done that, you can start going deeper in terms of actually understanding what your drivers are, like what are your aspirations, but also what holds you back. Where do you come from? What are the challenges that you face? How do you interact with other people? But you have to sort of take these things a step at a time, and you don't just build it as a group. You have to build it individually too, pairwise among people. And so the best teams that I've found that do this are the ones that invest time in doing it. One of the challenges that we face these days is we have so many meetings on our calendar that we now have gotten into meeting efficiency. And look, I'm a huge proponent of meeting efficiency and getting rid of unnecessary meetings. But your weekly staff meeting should not be, okay, let's get into it. What did we do last week? What are we doing this week? Who's behind? Who's on top?
And now we have a hard stop. Bye.
Exactly. And I've seen people use icebreakers, right? Like social questions to kick off a meeting, but I've also seen people use icebreakers and say, okay, we got 5 minutes for icebreakers. The signals you send as a leader about, like, hey, I want to hear your story, right? Is a really big one on there. Yeah.
I agree.
There's also an element from the top that I think happens on this one, which is, and this comes back to vulnerability. I think a lot of leaders still feel like they have to have all the answers, right? I also think that's where imposter syndrome comes from. It comes from people believing they have to have all the answers. And I think it's because we don't feel like we can be open about the fact that we don't. And that is a vulnerability, right? But one of the things that I try to help leaders understand is that you can do both things at once. You can have high aspirations, the mountain that you want the team to climb. And you can also say, I don't know the path. I don't fully know how we're going to get there, but I want us to do it together. I want your help in doing it. And so it's an invitation to people to share with you, to be more open with you, if you don't act like the know-it-all that I was when I was in my mid-20s.
Brian, I can't help but notice as we discuss all these things that everything that you have shared makes total sense. And actually, there has been a lot of evidence over the years that these things are entirely true. Just taking the last example of what you have mentioned, that leaders actually gain trust and confidence of their teams when they are willing to be vulnerable and admit that they don't have all the answers. And yet, as we both know, the reality, there's a gap, right? There's a gap between what we know to work and what we do in organizations. And I am really curious, what do you think stops us from basically implementing the knowledge that we have and also the, I think, intuitive understanding that we have about certain things in organizations? For some reason, the reality that you see is very often disconnected from that.
I think a lot of the challenges are societal and cultural in nature, right? We tend to reward, matter of fact, we do reward as societies, the know it all, right? The person who is highly successful, and this person has become highly successful in a field or an endeavor. And then they start sharing wisdom that they may not be at all in their field of endeavor at all. They may know nothing about, but because they are highly successful, they are seen as, someone who should be listened to. It's just sort of reinforcing the sort of ego driven, I am successful, therefore I must know all things type of aspiration that therefore trickles down in our organizations, right? Through that culture, we've sort of have trained people that the signals of hustle culture, the showing up early, the fast response to an email, the having a quick response and a quick answer is the path to success. And it just sort of continually reinforces those types of behaviors, which are actually contrary to what we know helps build better results inside of teams. But culturally, we reinforce them also by who we celebrate too often. And so I think that's a big part of the challenge is how do we shine more light on leaders who are more open, more vulnerable, but also who are highly successful.
Yeah, so true. Because if they don't go hand in hand, then it kind of defeats the purpose. So you do want to find those leaders who are successful at the same time. Do you have, I know that I'm putting you on the spot now, but in case you have any examples of leaders who really embody a lot of these things that we've talked about, or maybe companies where you feel like a lot of these practices have been embraced by leaders and employees and they are successful at the same time?
A great recent example, there's a company called Cotopaxi in the US. It's an outdoor apparel retailer. They're a B corporation, a benefits corporation. They are a highly successful brand. I mean, I happen to have some of their jackets, but also it's grown like crazy. Grace Unchick is a woman I've gotten to know who's the head of people and impact there. And what they've done is really sort of rethink what it means to have employees really engaged in the business in terms of not only the giving that they do and the volunteer activities, but it's things like they have gatherings and get togethers where it's not just the office staff, it's actually people who work in their distribution centers that come together as well. Right. So, ways in which they're signaling that everyone belongs and everyone is part of this, but also they're there to listen to the people who work in those distribution centers who are dealing with customer complaints and returns and issues to gather, feedback from it. And they do the same thing with people who are the office workers in terms of how do we work, how do we operate, how do we help you be more effective. And it shows in the results of the company, I think, as well, which is why it's sort of a great, if recent, example of mine.
And I think what they also did is a pretty bold move where they kind of raised everyone's salaries to create more equity. So for those workers who normally would have really just a minimum salary, they said, no, this is not fair. Yeah, you should have a salary that is adequate to the contributions that you are making. And that was incredibly well received, obviously. These are simple things, right? But yeah.
It is, and I've seen this is where it gets really interesting because most of these conversations tend to be about office workers, right? But frontline workers have the same needs, the same desires, the same challenges as employees. And I've heard senior executives say they'll just move for 10 cents. And that's not true at all. There's some research that has come out of Boston Consulting Group, one of my partners did, that shows it's actually the emotional aspects of work that get people to leave, right? It's back to you leave because of your boss. You don't leave because of the 10 cents. But it's, do I feel like I belong here? Do I feel like I've got potential here? Do I feel supported by my manager? Are really the things that drive whether or not you're going to stick around.
Yeah. We had Christy Harold in our community speaking during a fireside chat event. She's the CEO and founder of a company called Jam in Canada. And she actually shared her experience about how the culture that they've cultivated has helped her with retention. And an example that she has given was they really don't have a lot of people leaving for a better salary. And they are not paying top. She says, we cannot pay the highest salary in our industry at this moment, but we have a great culture. And so people don't leave. But we did have a couple people who recently decided to leave. And she said, we love you, we adore you, we're super sad to see you leave. But if it's a good opportunity for you, then of course we understand. But if at any point you want to return to Jam, just come back. We'll have
That's
you.
fantastic. That's
And she
fantastic.
said both of them came back
Yeah.
after 3 months. And she said, the message that this sends, if you are able to create that environment, is incredibly powerful, right? Because it's not
Absolutely.
just the people who came back, but also for the rest of the team, where you realize, oh, okay, actually, what we have here in terms of the environment, the colleagues, the atmosphere and the culture is worth so much more than extra $300 or whatever the amount is. So true.
It's a great example.
I wish we had more time because there are so many things that I want to ask you about, but I'm
Oh,
also
yeah.
mindful of time. Brian, we need to bring you back, obviously. I will ask you one question and then maybe we move to our rapid fire questions. And the question is there a question that I should have asked you but haven't? And, especially putting this frame of company culture on our conversation, because this is what we're particularly interested in. So, if you feel that I should have asked you something that's relevant to that.
I do think that it basically goes back to what are some of the misconceptions that I've heard from other leaders. And I think a lot of the misconceptions come back to executives who are my age, who are very used to culture being something that's always built in an office, right? That is about the ways in which we contributed to that culture, the all hands that we would hold inside of a company, the events that we would bring people to, the hallway conversations. And I think what a lot of those executives miss is two things. One is those conversations, that culture isn't just in the hallways. It's actually now in all the digital tools that your teams use. I worked at Slack, so I saw this firsthand. But there are so many people, especially the two generations of digital natives that are now in the workforce, that have adopted those tools not just for productivity, but they adopt them for culture. Favorite example recently, someone said, yeah, I started up a sneakerheads channel because there were 10 people in my New York office that I knew were big sneakerheads. And I just wanted us to be able to share tips and what are you finding and where are you finding it with each other. Those 10 people eventually became 150 people in the New York office. It eventually became several thousand people on a global basis who are all sneakerheads. And all of a sudden, we have a sneakerhead subculture inside of our organization. And when I talk to executives, they're like, okay, that's cute, but so what? And the answer is, you've just found ways in which you're helping people build weak ties. You're all concerned about weak ties in your organization, whether people feel a sense of belonging, whether they can actually connect with one another. Congrats. You got a self-organizing thing that's happening over here that's fantastic. And then the other thing that I remind executives of is, culture itself is not the all hands. It's not the events. It's all the behaviors that you exhibit. It's who you reward. It's what gets rewarded in an organization, who gets promoted, all the things that send a signal to everybody else of what that culture really is, as opposed to just the rah-rah moments.
Which is a perfect segue to the first question of the rapid fire questions. So, are you ready? Two
Sure, let's
minutes,
do it.
5 questions. Okay, let's do it. So, how do you define company culture?
At the end of the day, people like to say it's the attitudes and the behaviors inside of an organization, but I think it's what people do on a day-to-day basis and how they treat one another and how they interact that really defines what a culture looks like. It can be influenced by the top. It can be to some degree steered by the top, but it's really those day-to-day behaviors inside of an organization that will tell you what the culture really is.
And what is the sign, or perhaps multiple signs, that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
In an open, transparent company, one where people feel safe to talk, they will tell you. They will share what's not working with you. But you can also get data on this, and you can look at things like, if you have a set of values that you espouse as a company, if you're not measuring them in your preferably more than annual survey of employees, that tells you something right there, because you should be saying, what do your employees think? If you are, you can very quickly discern, what's going on and what's not. If you say that trust is a top value, but your company's ratings on trust are declining year on year, you have a problem. If you say that you value diversity, but your senior management team is all white men, you probably have a problem, right? And probably my least favorite is the phrase family, that, we're all family here. I think that's a bad idea for multiple reasons. The top one of which is you don't lay off people in a family.
Yeah,
these are
exactly.
businesses at the end of the day, and sometimes hard decisions need to be taken. So
We've already talked about companies that you admire for the culture, but I wonder if there are any additions that to your list of companies that you believe have a great culture that is good for people, but also good for the organization?
I mentioned Atlassian earlier in terms of what they do with gatherings, but I think they've done a really good job as well of defining sort of a employee-centric, team-centric way of working that actually has driven more engagement and involvement in people from a lot of different backgrounds that allows them to sort of build a very high-growth company, but to also have people feel like they belong there. And so Atlassian's another one that I admire.
Awesome. So final question of the series is any books that you would recommend to our listeners? And they don't have to be books on leadership or culture, perhaps even fiction. I don't know, anything that you believe would be good for people to read.
Jonathan Lethem is my favorite author, who's got a new book out as well. But Rick Rubin's Creative Act, I really liked. Rick Rubin, famous producer, you think he's going to talk about all the stars that he worked with. He doesn't. He talks about the act of creativity, the role of meditation, of mindfulness, of how he creates the space for people from very different walks of life to work together. I think it's fantastic. And the other one is Kim Scott's Just Work. Radical Candor was good. People abused and misused it in a number of ways, but I think her second book, Just Work, is really fantastic in terms of rethinking a lot of the tropes of success in businesses.
We had Kim on the podcast, so we're going to post the link to her interview for our listeners. So final extra question before you share with us, or what are the best places for people to find you and anything that you want to share with our listeners. And that is, who do you think I should have as the next guest on the show?
Grab Grace from Cotopaxi.
Okay, we'll try. And if you know her and can introduce us,
yeah,
that would
absolutely.
be amazing.
I love doing that. Love being able to connect people that I think have fantastic insights and are wonderful people.
That's wonderful. So finally, Brian, where can our listeners learn more about you, about your work, about the Future Forum, and any other initiatives that you are involved in?
Yeah, so futureforum.com has all the content that we generated over 3 years, tons of research, a lot of playbooks, everything from personal user manuals that I described earlier to how to build a team level agreement to insights on flexibility, inclusion, and connection. Sheila Subramanian, Helen Cupp, and I also wrote a book called How the Future Works. Audacious title, but very tactical, practical book. So pick that up. And you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Brian Elliott. That's the best place to find me.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for this conversation.
Aga, thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast. And this is the Culture Lab team.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Thank you for spending your time with Brian and me on this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. If you found this chat insightful, inspiring, or useful, and I'm guessing you did since you're still here, do me a favor, take a few seconds to share this episode and have a chat with someone about what you learned. Because when podcasts like this spark conversations, and those conversations turn into actions, that's when we start making real changes in the workplace together. And if you are looking to dig deeper into these topics and connect with others who are shaping the culture within their organizations, consider joining Culture Brain. We put together a cohort of the best, most ambitious culture leaders to help them accelerate progress in the culture work and create a culture roadmap for 2024. To find out more and apply, head over to tinyurl.com/culturebrain. And the link, it's in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in. If you want to get free resources on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser: agabayer.com/resources. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, please do it now. That's the best way you can support our work. And finally, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on the platform that you listen to. Thank you, and you are amazing for listening to this point. Not many people do.